Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Some 70 million people around the world have been dragged into extreme poverty due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In Europe, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict has caused an energy crisis and high inflation. And around the world, rising economic and geopolitical tensions continue to further destabilize and strain relations. Is de-globalization the new trend now? How has the Ukraine crisis impacted global order? And is it still possible for China and the United States, the world's two leading economies, to stop the decoupling and recommit themselves to improving trade and other exchanges? To find out more, I'm joined today by Nobel Laureate Michael Spence, Philip H. Knight Professor and Dean Emeritus at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. This is our topic. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Xu Qinduo. Professor Spence, first of all, I want to get your sense about the future of our world. Many economists say that deglobalization is already happening. There are various predictions about what kind of deglobalization is happening. So I just want to get your sense of whether you share this assessment, and if so, what are the consequences of this wave of deglobalization?
Well, I think it's, directionally it's correct. There's increasing fragmentation in the global economy. We are living in a world that, is shock prone, right? Climate shocks, war, pandemic, and so on. And so both businesses and countries in terms of policy have moved resilience and security up on the agenda. And you see in global supply chains a pattern of diversification, which is just really different from all of the last 4 decades. And this is expensive. It's contributing to inflation. It's contributing to a slowdown in growth. Here in Europe, we have a very high-speed version of diversification, away from dependence on fossil fuels from Russia. That's even more expensive than just, a normal pattern of diversification. And so, I don't think this is full deglobalization. I think full deglobalization is very difficult to achieve, but it's a much more fragmented and complex economic environment than we've been used to. So, and it will have consequences in terms of slower growth and maybe accessibility for some of the lower income countries. So it's not a direction that we want to keep going in for a long time. I think it has very negative effects.
Professor Spence, how do you look at the dichotomy between people's natural urge to want to trade, to want to travel to each other's countries, to learn from different cultures and civilizations, versus politicians' urge to win elections and re-elections, man-made barriers, trade-wise and otherwise, and rising nationalism that is often being catered to and exacerbated by, again, electoral politics around the world?
So the nationalism, it's always there. And there's always been, a sort of tension between the globalization and its benefits on the economic front and people's desire to kind of control their environment, which is a much more local kind of political phenomenon. I think the way forward is to manage better than we have in the past the distributional consequences of big changes, whether they're globalization or powerful new technologies. We have just, I think, underestimated the resistance that comes from failing to understand that people are adversely affected. Not all, not when you add up the benefits and costs, probably the benefits win, but the distributional effects are really important. And both domestically within our countries and internationally, we have to pay attention to this and adapt the rules of the road in such a way that we create political space and policy space to be able to deal with these issues. It's complicated, it's hard to do, but I think that's the direction that we should go.
Yeah, talking about the world economy, what do you think are the prospects for a global economic recovery in 2023? And what role do you think China might play in that process?
Well, so I think we're in for a period of slow growth. The forecasts keep bouncing around. They were very bad last summer, but and then they got worse later in the year, and now they're a little bit better, coming from influential institutions like the IMF. In Europe, um, we just got lucky. We were going to be hammered by the energy prices, but we've had an extremely mild winter.
Hmm.
So our natural gas supplies are much better matched to the demand situation than we thought. China's, reopening is just an enormous positive, not only for people in China, but for the rest of the global economy. It lowers the supply constraints that have contributed to inflation in the global economy. It brings China, back the growth itself. But China is such a big, important economy now that its growth has positive effects pretty much everywhere else in the global economy. So that's a huge positive, and everybody's hoping and expecting growth to accelerate reasonably quickly in China, and so that you'll have a good year and probably an even better year next year.
Yeah, that really leads to my next question. How important do you think China's full recovery for economic growth, and what can Chinese policymakers, especially economic and finance policymakers, do to really help spur global growth going forward?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to kind of, take care of whatever challenges there are in the domestic economy. I mean, I think from an outsider's point of view, and my friends in China know a whole lot more about this in the world of economics and policy. But I think stabilizing the real estate situation is really quite important. Probably carefully targeted fiscal programs to help struggling businesses and even some of the consumers get back on their feet, because the pandemic was a pretty big hit, right? Um, and China has the fiscal space and resources to get this done. And then I think that the resumption of a kind of heavily focused sort of economic and financial reform agenda, which seems to be what is being talked about now in China, is just important. Kind of opening up, reforming various things in the financial system. Getting back on board with respect to supporting sort of rapid technological development in multiple areas. I'm not just talking about the big platforms, but you have an enormously vigorous entrepreneurial activity in digital and life sciences and biomedical and an important energy transition technology sector as well. So, just being enthusiastic and supporting that will be an enormous positive for Chinese growth and for the rest of the world.
Yeah, Professor Spence, you predicted a slow recovery after the COVID as we're moving beyond COVID. What do you think would be the impact specifically for people living in the emerging markets and developing economies if you compare that to the lives of people living in Western Europe and the United States?
So I think, in the so-called developed countries, Europe, most of Europe and the United States, we're living in a different world. We have supply side constraints. We have aging, just as you do in China. We have to deal with these things. I think the vast majority of the big emerging markets, China at the top of the list, but India coming along, Indonesia, some of the Latin American countries have the resources to deal effectively with the challenges of a slower growth environment and to do pretty well. The group that worries me. So I'm really dividing the developing countries and emerging markets into the middle income ones that I think are going to do pretty well, and then these lower income countries in South Asia and in Africa and to some extent in Latin America. They have big challenges just sort of getting started with the growth process. But when you add the climate shocks, the pandemic shock to their fiscal resources and medical systems, and a host of other factors, financial instability, borrowing and foreign hard currencies, I think they're in great trouble. And we need a kind of global focus on getting them back on their feet so that they can rejoin the global economy, contribute to the labor supply globally, relieve the supply constraints. We'll all benefit from that. But right now they're in a very, very tough position. I sometimes describe their situation as a kind of perfect storm.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for that analysis. Hopefully, policymakers will be noting your advice. You've been watching Dialogue. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break. Talking about the future of the world once again, China has proposed this community with a shared future for mankind. And also Wang Yi, director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Commission of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, recently at the Munich Security Conference once again said, and I quote, that the humanity can overcome challenges when united and win victory with mutual trust. And actually, not so long ago, the new Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang at a press conference said that China's Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative are the way forward to solve the security dilemma and the development deficit of the world. How do you look at the merits of these Chinese proposals for solving some of our most salient problems today?
So I think they're exactly in the right direction. China has been clear about the importance of, kind of shared prosperity, not just within China, but across the global economy, the importance of having a reasonably open, pragmatically constructed multilateral system that doesn't exclude people. But I think the core of getting on with this agenda is a serious effort, bilateral effort to rebuild trust between China and the United States and between China and Western Europe. And and the pandemic really didn't help with this because we lost those kinds of personal contacts that we're all used to that are part of building that trust. So I think, the core, it's directionally, it's absolutely right, but trust is critical. And the way you build trust is through interaction.
Yeah, and also we noted that according to economic data in recent years, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed more people into poverty. Actually, 70 million people are now in extreme poverty, and the global median income dropped for the first time since the 1990s. How serious is this problem?
It's serious for sure. But it's more serious in places that can't recover. I mean, I think the vast majority of people in the world now live in places that have the capacity to make a recovery. So, I wouldn't put this in the category of catastrophic at all, but I do think it deserves attention, policy attention, and especially international policy attention directed toward the more vulnerable countries where these shocks that they've absorbed are harder to absorb than they are for a China or the United States or the European countries and so on, or even the higher just the collection of higher middle income emerging economies who are well on their way to becoming advanced economies or high income economies. So that's where my concern lies. I think if this turns into a long-term negative problem, that's where it's probably going to happen.
Professor Spence, what do you think of the role of WTO in mediating world trade disputes these days? Because we've seen many cases whereby it's up to the nation state, whereby economic engagement and policies, especially trade policies, trade negotiations are being conducted and determined. Is WTO being hollowed out? What are the merits of WTO existing in today's world?
So WTO, remains an important institution. It has struggled, right? And everybody knows it struggled to put together, in the kind of pre-GFC period, and even up till now, put together, kind of comprehensive additional sort of trade and economic opening agreements. They have two functions. One is to do that, and I think the challenge is great. And they deserve support because we're living in a more complicated global world. We need agreements that have to do with data and digital technologies that weren't there 20 years ago. And so the WTO is a natural place to sort of get together and do that. Now, whether they do that or not, I don't know. But the other function of the WTO is to adjudicate actual trade disputes, right? in other words, we disagree with each other. China will file a complaint about something that happened in Europe or the United States or vice versa. Somebody has to decide whether the complaint has merit or not. It's sort of like a judiciary for, the international trading system. And there, I think, what needs to happen. So what's gone wrong there is that numerous countries have decided to ignore the WTO decisions when they're made, when they're not in their favor. And I think there's a pretty high benefit to recommitting to being respectful of this aspect of the WTO activity, regardless of how much progress they make on, creating new agreements that surround new parts of the economy. We still need somebody, that's reasonably impartial in an institution that's well governed to tell us, when we've stepped out of line. And we can't get there if all the big countries decide that they'll ignore the decisions whenever they don't like the outcome.
Professor Spence, I really want to pick your brain on this issue, that is, trade and economic sanctions launched by successive U.S. governments. Actually, barely a week ago, I interviewed the president of a key Mideastern country. I'm not going to name the name of the country. I don't want to get you in trouble of any sort, but that country's president told me that there have been 8 successive U.S. governments launching economic or maintaining economic sanctions against that country, and the economic sanctions are still in place. I mean, that is clearly a violation of, international obligations, one way or the other, right?
Yep. No, so this is a major issue. We on the one hand, we do have increasing use of sanctions and sort of economic and financial policies, especially by the United States, in order to achieve non-economic goals, right, as tools of international interaction and diplomacy. And there's a very large collection of people all over the world, so lots of them in Europe and so on, who wonder if we really want to go down this road, right? Because it has extremely negative consequences, for the coherence and cohesion of the kind of global trading and financial system. So, I don't have great answers for it. I mean, is it better to actually have, conflict, on the ground or sanctions? But we need to find a way. The place I've come to on this is a very important question, is we need to find a way to agree to restrict the use of sanctions to very extreme circumstances, so that they don't just become a commonplace. Anytime we disagree with you, whoever we is, then we impose sanctions if we can. I mean, there's questions about how effective these sanctions are, because the global, the market economies are pretty good at end running restrictions anyway. But there's a serious issue. And
but from an economic point of view, Professor Spence, do you think economic sanctions defeat their own purpose, in the sense that it's not only punishing the government, the regimes Washington said it will punish, but also the very people living in that country, if you look at statistics throughout the decades, economic-wise?
Yes, but then the question is, what's the alternative, right? So yes, somebody attacks somebody else, right? You've got a bunch of options. You can say, well, it's got nothing to do with us, right? Or you can say, along with other countries, well, we're going to sort of react to that, and then you get the sanctions and this difficult question. But sure, I mean, there's lots of aspects of international interactions in which any entity takes actions that have costs both to the opponent and domestically, for sure, right? It would be nice if we lived in a world in which that never happened, but we don't.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And also, we've been facing multiple crises. In China, we say it's a triple fold crisis. The China-U.S. Cold War launched by Washington, and also the Ukraine crisis, that is a hot war, and the pandemic, which is a public health crisis. What is your advice for policymakers and business leaders in navigating the complex and rapidly changing global economic landscape?
I mean, on the business side and the financial side, I think what you're seeing is people are taking defensive action. I mean, and defensive action frequently has the point of diversifying your activities, right? I mean, on the analogy with financial diversification, so you diversify supply chains. It's expensive, right? It contributes to higher costs and even inflation. But in a world where you don't control the shocks, and these, climate, we have climate change, right? These are big shocks. They are, frequent, severe, and disruptive, both from a kind of human point of view, but also from a business and economic point of view. So I think the pattern of diversification is the direction that we're going. And as long as we live in a shock-prone world, that's the direction we're going to go, and it's going to have consequences. Now, some of these shocks are, in a sense, self-delivered, as you implied. I mean, geopolitical tensions can be high or low, and those are choices that countries and leaders make. And maybe we can sort of tamp that down over time by rebuilding trust and, reconstructing the relationships in a positive way. But we're not going to get rid of the shock. So, we're going to think of it this way. Economic security has been elevated on the agenda for almost everybody, whether they're in business or a policy-making position. I think that's inevitable. And economic security and economic policy now overlaps with national security, partly because of digital technology in a way that we're not used to. And we haven't figured out a way to manage the balancing act between the national security requirements for China, for the United States, for anybody, balance that against, the benefits of having a relatively open, global system, financial and trading and technology system. So that, the rubber hits the road in the technology area, right? I mean, to get the climate change agenda done in a way that, saves us, we need really open global flows of technology. I mean, if everybody starts trying to build these technologies on their own, we're just never going to get there, right? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, everybody agrees that artificial intelligence has military and national security applications that we can't just ignore.
Yeah, in your book, The Next Convergence, you argue that the convergence between developed and developing economies is occurring at an unprecedented pace. Of course, that was many years ago. To what extent do you still think so?
I still think it's happening. I mean, it probably may not happen at the speed we thought it was going to, but I don't see anything, dramatic that is an obstacle in the way of the vast majority of emerging economies achieving their economic goals, including achieving some version of high income status. The only group, and I know I sound like I'm repeating myself, the only group I worry about now are the low income countries. It's the headwinds that they face in order to jumpstart the growth process in a way that many countries, China, South Korea, Singapore, etc., have done. They're trying to do it in a much more difficult economic environment than their predecessors, and I worry about them. Now, everybody else, I would. I mean, there's lots of things. When I wrote that book, there's lots of things we didn't see. We didn't see the digital transformation coming. We did know we had a sustainability problem, but I have not lost my confidence in the inclusiveness of the growth patterns with respect to convergence. I think it's going to happen.
I share your hope too, and I hope that will be the case. Thank you so much for coming on our show, and thank you for your insights. Much appreciated. That was Professor Michael Spence. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing, sitting in for Xu Jinde. Thank you for tuning in. Bye and take care.